This is my 49 World War II slide presentation. So first we're going to start before the war started, 1923 up until 1939. So Nazi Party, Hitler took power. He was initially sent to spy on the Nazi Party to basically, the military wanted to know what they were doing, but he fell in love with the Nazi Party metaphorically and became the biggest champion of it. Now, in the city of Munich, the Nazis tried a push, a takeover, and it started at a beer hall. So we call it the Munich Beer Hall Push. Now, this failed, and Hitler was sentenced to 5 years in prison. While he was in prison, he wrote Mein Kampf, which translates to My Struggle, and basically it became the Bible for the Nazi Party. It became their manifesto. After he got out, he rebuilt the Nazi Party because in his absence, it had kind of waned, it was not as powerful as it was. And then in 1933, he wins the chancellorship of Germany. Several years later, the president of Germany dies, and with no one to succeed him, Hitler basically says, you know what, I'm going to be president too, so I'm just going to be the supreme leader of Germany, call me the Führer. And so that's why he's called the Führer, which means leader, and he made the German armed forces swear an oath of allegiance to him. He had an amazing cult following. He could make a speech. I've read a few of his speeches translated, and he gets into your head. He also engineered one of the greatest economic comebacks in history. You know, as I said before, the German economy was so far down the crapper they couldn't see light anymore. But he turned Germany into a great economic power. He gave everybody jobs, and he rebuilt his nation's military in defiance of the Treaty of Versailles. Now, across the world, you've got Japan, and after the Treaty of Versailles, they felt kind of left out of the treaty and the treaty negotiations. So this led to some imperial ambitions that they had. In 1931, they conquered Manchuria, which is, if you look at a map of China, Manchuria is kind of that northern part that goes up into Russia. And they began to build a powerful navy to dominate the Pacific. In 1937, they invade China. Now, they're building up this powerful navy, but they're doing something revolutionary. They're focusing on aircraft carriers instead of battleships. Now, for years, it had been battleships, big guns, prize fights. But, you build these aircraft carriers, you fly planes off of them, they can strike hundreds of miles away from the mothership, and you can beat battleships a lot easier with these. So, going into Italy now, they expanded into Africa after Benito Mussolini took power in 1922. He also launched a fascist takeover of the country with his black shirt militia, kind of like the SS stormtroopers that Hitler had. In 1940, he signed the Tripatriot Act with Nazi Germany and Japan, and this in turn created the Axis as we know it. And he, along with Hitler, supported Francisco Franco, who was fighting for the fascist cause in Spain. He sent weapons to the fascists. Hitler sent aircraft and stuff like that. They actually destroyed a Spanish town, and there's a Pablo Picasso painting about it. And it was really the first time that air power was really put on display for the world. If anyone has any questions at all during this time. Fascist Spain. Sorry, the picture kind of cut it out. So, the nations that would now be known as the Allies, everyone was kind of suffering from the Great Depression. The UK was mostly unaffected by it and what was going on in Europe. And under their Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, no word beyond whether he's related to Mr. Chamberlain, he attempted to appease Hitler, try to say, okay, you can have this, but don't take any more. but he was very weak on it, so Hitler just kept taking more and more, as we'll go into. And the Soviet Union is reorganizing under Joseph Stalin, who he made a secret pact with Hitler. He was going to attack Poland and into Finland, I believe. And so that didn't turn out very well for the Soviets. And then the U.S., as you know, as you guys have been studying for the last couple of weeks, is still in the grasp of the Depression at this time.
What happened to other countries, like the smaller countries that were involved in World War I during this time?
I'm just focusing on the big parts. If you want to talk about Mexico's contribution to the Allied powers in World War II...
Dude, Finland. Finland all the
I
way.
will talk about Finland later. Finland went ham. So, in 1939, and even before, the clouds of war started to gather above Europe. And so, as the clouds start gathering, the main participants, there were hundreds of other nations involved. Mexico, Portugal, all these other little countries were involved. I just don't want to mention them because this is 95% of everyone involved. The UK, the US, the French who got out after the evacuation at Dunkirk, and the French resistance groups who fought in Vichy France. Now, there's a difference between France and the Vichy French. French troops under Charles de Gaulle got out after Dunkirk and they fought the Nazis. Vichy France was a Nazi puppet government. The Nazis didn't want to run France, so they took a few Frenchmen, most notably among them Charles Pétain, and just said, you're going to run France now, you're going to do what we tell you to do, and deal with it. So some of the leaders during the war, the president was Franklin Roosevelt, as we know. His vice president was Harry Truman. Later in the war, he becomes president. Neville Chamberlain, who we talked about, Prime Minister of the UK, and then I told you to hold on to the name Winston Churchill from the World War I presentation. He's going to become Prime Minister. Joseph Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union, I talked about, and then Charles de Gaulle, leader of the Free French. Now on the other side, Hitler, as we know, Benito Mussolini, who I don't care what anybody said, he didn't make Italy's transfer on time. That was all propaganda. And then Emperor Hirohito ran Japan in their war effort. Hirohito. So, and these are just pictures of some of the leaders: FDR and Truman, Stalin, de Gaulle, Churchill. That mustache, though.
Which one is Chamberlain's?
Up here. Chamberlain is the one on the right in that picture. Winston Churchill's on the left. A little bit.
This is the top half.
So, in 1938, Germany annexes Austria. They called it the Anschluss. This was started kind of some of their first moves of the war. They did this, and then after the Munich conference, they took over Czechoslovakia. Got you, Jan. And so this was, Neville Chamberlain. He was saying, don't do this, but England and France didn't do anything about it. The Germans took back the Rhineland, which had been taken by them from France after World War I, it's kind of the industrial heart of Germany. And so they forced several other small states like Bohemia and Slovakia to capitulate, and the rest of Europe just basically looks on like nothing's going on. They really didn't want to start a fight over it, and so that's what emboldened Hitler to do what he did, pretty much, is he didn't think that the other European countries had the guts to try to stop him, so he went ahead and did what he did. Goes in tight.
Thank you.
So, the outbreak of the war came on September 1st, 1939. Germans called it, I believe it was Case Weiss, where they they said that Polish forces attacked across the border. No Polish soldier in his right mind would have attacked into Nazi Germany. So it was a big lie technique to say, oh, we're doing this for defensive purposes, quote unquote. Well, the Germans tore through the Polish in 26 days using different type, a new type of war. They called it Blitzkrieg, translates to lightning war. It was super fast, and it basically destroyed everything in their path. So over this invasion, France and the UK enter the war, but they don't intervene in time to save Poland at all. The Soviet Union attacks Poland too on their side, and so they get a small piece of Poland. They also attacked Finland at this time, and Finland was kind of a bad deal for the Soviets. That's the sniper with the most confirmed kills. For the life of me, cannot remember his name. I couldn't even pronounce it, but they called him the White Death. Killed over 500 Soviet soldiers in there.
It was like 602.
It was like
something like that.
505.
It
It was 505, dude. Trust me. And so the Soviets didn't have a good time in Finland. So after Poland fell, it was called the Phoney War. Germany was invading all these countries in Europe, and France and Britain were only throwing token measures at it. They didn't see this as a real threat. But on May 10th, 1940, Neville Chamberlain resigns, and Winston Churchill, the head of basically an all-party coalition government, the British government basically said, all right, we're going to stop fighting over these party politics, and we're going to get together, and we're going to beat the Nazis. So Winston Churchill takes power. On June 4th, the British Expeditionary Force in country, a bunch of French troops and other, token forces from other countries have been taken over, evacuate from Dunkirk. And this was a huge event because this was almost 500,000 troops leaving in the face of basically all the guns of the Nazis turned on them. And this is one of the big things that helps us later in the war. As this is going on, Churchill gives one of his most famous speeches saying, we shall fight on the beaches, we'll fight in the hedgerows, in the streets. That basically Britain's going to fight to the end against the Nazis. There's that speech, his never before has so much been owed to so few, and then his blood, toil, and sweat speech. So, after the fall of Dunkirk came the Battle of Britain, which was the first major air campaign in history, and was daily air battles between the Royal Air Force, the British Air Force, and Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. So there were 4 main stages of the battle. The Channel battles this was just over the English Channel, they'd shoot at each other, it'd all be good. And then came the Eagle attack, which was the Germans started attacking the airfields on the coast of Britain. Then they stepped it up to just targeting airfields. That was the most critical phase of the battle because if, a plane on the ground can't fight back. So if you destroy the British Air Force on the ground, there's nothing left to challenge you in the air. You can do what you want, pretty much. But in that time, during the fight for the airfields, the British were sending bombers at night into Nazi Germany. And the first bombing raid actually killed the only elephant in the Berlin Zoo. And after that, Hitler made his first mistake. He basically got mad, which is what the British wanted them to do, and started to switch the attacks to British towns and cities. Bad news for 40,000 British civilians, good news for the Royal Air Force because they could breathe. They had time to get themselves together and start fighting the Nazis again. And so, because they were given this time, they were able to beat back the Nazis, they couldn't bomb England anymore, and so they had to abandon the invasion of it. And this was Hitler's first defeat, and this set in the stage a spiral of more defeats that would lead to him putting a gun in his mouth. Now, this is how the division was at the Battle of Britain. The British had almost 2,000 aircraft against 2,500 German aircraft. The disparity in trained pilots was also very one-way too. The Germans had almost 1,500 trained, battle-hardened pilots. These guys had actually gone up and been shot at. The British, for the most part, hadn't. They had, gone through fighter pilot school, and congratulations, you're a fighter pilot now. And so as the battle dragged on, they shoved a bunch of untrained rookies into the cockpit. They basically said, okay, this is the controls, this is how you fly the plane, these are the guys to kill, go have fun. And so this is why, a lot of these untrained pilots are most of the British Air Force casualties.
Here you go. Here's a plane you've never flown before. Good luck.
They give them an intro. They give them a crash course, per se. And so, for the losses, the British only lost about 550 people. Most of them were these untrained rookies. But in comparison, the Germans almost lost 3,000 people. So it's a very good ratio, even though, a lot of people will say, any loss is too much, but 544 to 3,363 is a pretty good kill-to-death ratio. I don't care how you put it. The Germans lost a lot of the aircraft they committed, while the British were able to quickly replace their factories went into overtime, constantly producing these new aircraft. They had people would just give their money and stuff to fund these aircraft. But as the Germans started bombing, they called it the Blitz. 40,000 civilians were killed, more were wounded, lots of London and other cities were destroyed, but in the end, this is why Hitler didn't win in the West. If he had won in the West, if he had taken Britain, the US would have had a really bad time trying to take back mainland Europe. Because England, as we'll see, was kind of our unsinkable aircraft carrier. And that's where we basically put everything. So after Hitler made his first mistake, he made his big second mistake. He did the one thing you never ever do. He invaded Russia. So on June 22nd, he invaded the Soviet Union, and they caught the Soviets off guard. The Soviets didn't think that, the Nazis would do this. They had a treaty. But, so because of this, the Nazis just ran through the Soviet Union. They were at Moscow by the end of the year. And one of the reasons why they didn't take Moscow is because they were so confident that they would, we'll tear through the Russians in a couple of weeks, it won't be a problem. But they got bogged down, and when winter set in, they didn't have, this cold weather gear, food, clothes, stuff like that. So they were bogged down, the Russians had it, and they didn't. So the Soviet Union turned into, it was their big second mistake, and I think this is what ultimately cost the Nazis the war. Now, as the Germans were invading the Soviet Union, they didn't treat the Soviets very well, so there was a lot of resentment between the Russians and the Germans at this time. And we'll see this later as the war starts to wind to a close. Now, other side of the world, in the Pacific, the Japanese took control of the Dutch East Indies Islands, which is a huge oil reserve, which is one of the things they were looking for, Japan is it's an island nation. They don't have the resources that a continental nation like the US has. So they had to go out and take these islands that had the resources that they need. On December 7th, they attacked Pearl Harbor, but that was only one of many strikes that they did. So they took a bunch of islands, they landed on a bunch of islands, started fighting American troops, and, we were unprepared for it. We didn't think war was going to happen. So by May 1942, our last stronghold in the Pacific, the Philippines, fell, and Douglas MacArthur left, but he vowed to return, and he would. So the war has started now, and so after the US enters the war, it's pretty much the turning point of this whole thing. It doesn't look good for a little while, but certain things will happen in the intelligence war. This is one of the big factors of why we were able to win. At Midway, before the Battle of Midway, we broke the Japanese code, and we were able to we basically lured them into a trap at Midway, and we were able to defeat them, as I'll talk about in a little bit. The German Enigma code, which was supposed to be uncrackable, they used it for all their transmissions and stuff, was broken in early 1940. The movie The Imitation Game talks about this. Great movie, by the way. So that was broken in early 1940, so we were reading the Nazis' manual. The OSS, the Office of Special Services, the forerunner to the CIA, and the Special Operations Executive, the forerunner to, British MI6, Secret Intelligence, they supported the French resistance, which was huge. These people provided havens for our bombers who were shot down. They helped us before the battles of Normandy, and just generally harassing the Nazis behind our lines. And both the Americans and the British penetrated the German government. The German government really wasn't good with this, and the German intelligence service wasn't even worth having. They were terrible. The British discovered every German spy that they sent, and they ended up turning each to become double agent working for Britain against the Nazis. So the Nazis really weren't that good in the whole spy game. Now, I was talking about Battle of Midway. This is how it looked on paper. 3 American carriers against 6 Japanese ones. The Americans were outnumbered 3-1. It should have been an easy Japanese victory. They should have just ran through the troops we put at Midway. But instead, we won. We sunk 2/3 of their carriers committed for 1/3 of ours, and we stopped their plans, and we dealt them their first real defeat in the Pacific. And after this, they were pretty much done. They were always on the back foot, they were always retreating, we were always on the offensive in the Pacific. A book I read was, it was about a torpedo squadron, and there were 3 flights of torpedo planes. They flew in low above the wave tops, but they didn't have anyone else with them, so they were all shot down. But because, the Japanese were so confident, they didn't look up, and when bombers came over, they just wrecked the carriers because they weren't looking up. They were looking down for more torpedo planes. So another battle going on at the same time, through the whole war really, was the Battle of the Mid-Atlantic. And this was Allied shipping to and from the United Kingdom against German submarines, U-boats. The US and the UK had the Lend-Lease Agreement, which is we sold them weapons and war material and stuff like that, and they paid us for it. And the Germans, like any smart adversary ever, didn't like this, so they tried to stop it. They might have come close. They sunk about 3,500 ships, and 258,000 tons of cargo went with those ships. And that, if they were able to choke off Britain's an island, they can't self-sustain, so Britain needed us. So if they were able to choke it off, they would have been able to force Britain to they could starve them out, basically. But that didn't happen. I believe this is what the movie Das Boot is about, another great foreign movie. Just the U-boats, Battle of the Mid-Atlantic, all that. Now, in the East, the Soviets weren't having a good time. The Germans were just destroying everything in their path. But Hitler decided that he was going to kind of do a below-the-belt punch towards Stalin. So he decided to send his troops out of their way to a place they really didn't need, called Stalingrad, Stalin's namesake town, the only town he really named after himself. So they surrounded the city, and there were still Soviet troops trapped inside. And so they were fighting basically room to room with each other. This was the first real case of urban combat in history. So they were fighting room to room with each other. The winter was setting in, it was really nasty. The Soviets got their act together and they fought the Germans off. They surrounded, there were 3 circles. There was the initial Russian forces in Stalingrad. There was the German forces trying to kill those Russian forces inside Stalingrad, and then there was the Russians who came after, who surrounded Stalingrad. And this was the first time the Germans surrendered in this war, and this was one of their defeats in the East that led to the Soviets taking the initiative and starting to charge west. That other defeat was in the Battle of Kursk, the biggest battle ever in the history of all time. I just took, for a lot of these numbers, I took the lowball numbers. So at least 3 million people participated in this battle. It was one of the longest ones of the war, and almost a third of those died. Again, lowball numbers. It was all tank warfare pretty much. It was the last great German, it was really their last great attack. I mean, you can call the Battle of the Bulge a good one, but it wasn't really this size and scale. So this, along with Stalingrad, really was the turning point in the East. After this, Grigory Zhukov and the Soviets started charging west towards Berlin, and they did not stop. So, pressured by the Soviets, the UK and the US opened up a new front in the war. They conducted Operation Torch, which was the landings in North Africa. So they had initial successes. They took Morocco, which was Vichy France, and they were able to take the city of Casablanca, which is where the classic movie Casablanca is, highly recommended. And so they started pushing across North Africa through Libya towards Tunisia. At Kasserine Pass, which is, I believe it's in Tunisia, Nazi forces under Erwin Rommel just destroyed the Allies, charging. And so after Kasserine Pass, the Allies reorganized under George S. Patton and Bernard Montgomery, and they got together and destroyed Rommel's Africa Corps. And, I can talk forever about Patton if you really wanted me to. But for sake of time, I'm not. So after the US entered the war, that's when the strategic bombing campaign against Germany really went into high gear. The British were doing it, they were sending bombers at night, but the Americans sent heavy bombers during the day, thousands of them, over Germany. Now in the early years, we didn't have fighters to escort them all the way. We could escort them maybe half of the way, but then they'd have to go back and refuel and the bombers would be alone. Well, the Germans took advantage of this and just straight up mauled the bombers. They had, they had the second highest attrition rate. They had the second highest casualties in any Allied unit in the war. Number one was Pacific submarines. But there were more bomber crewmen killed than any other group. Just because this was how you basically flew over the target, you basically flew in a straight line. There were a couple thousand of you, so you were flying 15 feet from someone else's wings. So if you moved, you'd crash into someone else. And so the 1,000 of you would go over your target, you'd keep going, you'd drop your bombs, and you'd plaster a 15 square mile area. And that was precision bombing back in the day. So really heavy losses were taken, but enough of the bombers got through to destroy the German economy. They weren't able to build stuff for the war. They were able to destroy a lot of military units and weaken the morale of the German people. They destroyed, cities like Dresden and Cologne were just destroyed. They were flattened. And so a lot of great historical and art treasures were lost, but would you rather have destroyed all this great historical stuff or let the Nazis run wild? So after Torch, the Allies pretty much took control of the war. It was all them for the rest of it. They started going on offensive in both the Pacific and in Europe. In the Pacific, US forces were basically jumping island to island. We'd land on an island, clean the Japanese off of it, and then we'll go land on another island. So that started at Guadalcanal after the Battle of Midway in 1943, and we just kept going at every island. We had there was a North group and a South group, and they met up at, I believe it was Iwo Jima. In Europe, the Soviets pushed the Germans back to basically where they were before the war, and kept charging. And then in Europe, the US and the UK conducted Operation Husky and invaded Italy. One of my favorite stories to come out of this is it's called Operation Mincemeat, and it was not the Soviets, I don't know what I'm thinking. The British found the body of a street drunk, dressed him up as a major in the intelligence service, gave him some incriminating documents about how the Allies were going to land on, Corsica, Sardinia, those two islands out there in the Mediterranean, and made sure the body washed up ashore in, I believe it was Spain, because the Spanish they weren't fighting with the Nazis, but they were supporting them. And so the Nazis thought, oh, they're going to invade these islands, they're not going to invade Italy, so they reinforced those islands and we invaded Italy. That was one of the weird ones I read. A book I just finished reading actually is, I'm going to talk about him a little bit. Hermann Göring, he was the commander of the German Air Force. His nephew, that branch of the family had moved to America, his nephew was a bomber pilot. And Werner Göring, his nephew, his co-pilot was ordered to shoot him dead if they were going to be captured. So the Allies wouldn't want them to get the, a propaganda thing that, oh, he came over from the American side and defected, and so Nazis are better. So these are some of the notable military leaders. Dwight Eisenhower, the commander of all forces in Europe. He later went on to become president after Truman. I don't know if he lost the election or just didn't run. And there was George Patton, who I could talk for days about. He was basically a rock star general. He got it done, but he did it with a lot of flair, a lot of bravado. Bernard Montgomery, who was Patton's rival, really, in British, they bumped heads a lot. And then Georgy Zhukov, who was a Soviet general who dug the Soviets out of Stalingrad and then led the charge west. On the Nazi side, there was Erwin Rommel. They called him the Desert Fox, and he was the Nazi equivalent to Patton, and they squared off. There's a scene in the movie Patton where, Patton wishes him and Rommel could meet, two tankers, have a drink, and then fight in their tanks, and whoever won the battle would win the war. And Hermann Göring, who I talked about, the commander of the German Air Force, who was one of the people who signed on supporting the final solution, which that comes later. So these are just some pictures of the military leaders. We left off yesterday talking about the European theater. Now we're going to talk about some of the leaders in the Pacific. Douglas MacArthur, who I talked about yesterday, he was an American general who was in the Philippines when basically the war started, and he tried to hold it against the Japanese, but he didn't. He wasn't able to, so he left. But he vowed he would return. He was a lot like Patton. They both had massive egos. I mentioned this in my World War I presentation. They met on the battlefields of Europe at one point. Chester Nimitz, who was the Pacific equivalent of Eisenhower, controlling all the naval forces and pretty much directing what went down. And then Halsey and Spruce, who were two American admirals, they traded off control of some of the main carrier groups, attacking the Japanese and really taking the fight to them. Now on the Japanese side, there wasn't really anyone worth mentioning except for Admiral Yamamoto, who was the architect of the December 7th attacks. He was basically why the Japanese were so successful in the early part of the war. And he was actually killed. We broke their naval codes, so we learned that he was going to travel from somewhere in the Philippines to another island, and we actually shot his plane down and killed him. The largest piece of his body we found was his hand clutching a samurai sword. So, and then Shiro Ishii, the only other one really worth mentioning, he was the commander of Unit 731, and that was a group that did a lot of chemical and biological warfare experiments for the Japanese. This was mainly in China, and so this was part of the reason why, they were a big part of the Japanese killing a whole lot of Chinese during the war and during their occupation of it, which led to the Japanese really don't like the Chinese really don't like the Japanese, so Asian circle of love. And these are just the pictures of some of the leaders.
That's a big pipe.
Yeah, he smoked that pipe everywhere. So, from 1944 to 1945, it was the war had turned. You know, in the beginning, it was all Germany, all Japan. Now the tide is kind of turned. And one of the big things that turned that tide was Operation Overlord, which was the invasion of occupied France. Now, at midnight on June 6th, the American paratroopers started landing in occupied France. This is what the movie Saving Private Ryan is about. This is also what the show Band of Brothers is about. I highly recommend both of them. They were all elements of the 101st and 82nd Airborne, and there's, I don't know where you buy them, but there's a special sort of jump boot out there, and it has, in honor of what they did, 101 stitches on the outside and 82 on the inside. So, I don't know where you can find them, called Cochrane Army jump boots, but those are there. At 5:30 in the morning, a group of Army Rangers, the first Army Rangers as we know them today, landed at, I believe, outside Utah Beach to take out some really heavy German guns in the area. So they paved the way for the landings at Utah Beach. And then starting at about 7 o'clock, the landings started to begin at Store Beach, Omaha, all this. And you see, the opening scene of Saving Private Ryan, where they're storming Omaha Beach, is very realistic to what happened on the beaches. And it's, I personally think it's the greatest war scene I've ever seen in a movie. And people have said that it is very accurate. So after the Normandy landings, the Allies had a foothold in Europe. One of the big things was Normandy wasn't a port. It wasn't a port city as, if someone invaded Seattle, they could use the port facilities there to bring their troops in. We didn't have that at Normandy. And the other ports along the coast of France were very heavily defended by the Nazis. So we basically built our own port there. We had basically 3 or 4 bridges running from England across the English Channel to France. And we were sending trucks and stuff over this back and forth. They called them the Mulberry Harbors. It was a huge feat of engineering. Now, the Allies liberated Paris on August 25th. One of the reasons why we were able to move so quickly is because of what the French resistance was doing, and the paratroopers we had inserted, they were so spread out all over the place, the Germans couldn't pin them down, and so they were causing all sorts of havoc. And actually, with the liberation of Paris, Patton's Third Army was just, they could see Paris, they could move into Paris at any time, and there were no German forces in Paris, but Eisenhower told him to hold his position while a French unit got the symbolic victory of, taking back their city. Even though Patton still got reported in a lot of the papers for taking the city. So the Allies kept pushing across France, and one of the things that kind of slowed their advance was these hedgerows, these huge, intricate these bushes and systems. It's basically a death trap if you're on foot. Tanks couldn't go in there until, on the beaches they call them hedgehogs. It's basically steel I-beams welded up, looks like a jacks, if you ever played with those as a kid. And so they basically dismantled them, put the iron spikes on the front of their tanks, and they were able to drive through the hedgerows. So they were able to make progress through France until they arrived at the Ruhr River, where the Germans made their stand. Now in the east, the Soviets are still pushing across Eastern Europe, closing in on Germany and Berlin. In the Pacific, the Americans we called it island hopping. We would go from one island, we would jump up the next one in the chain until we had secured that island chain. And then we'd go to the next island chain, one island at a time. And so the real decisive victory after Midway was the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which after that point the Japanese could no longer mount an actual naval resistance to the American fleet, which was marauding into Japan. And in mid-1944, we started bombing the Japanese home islands, which is another point of controversy that'll come up a little bit later, but we started doing that then, and they also started stockpiling for, the Japanese thought we were going to invade Japan, we were actually planning on it, but I'll get to all that in a minute or so.
1944?
Yep.
Shame.
What's shame?
Nothing.
Ridiculous. So, the final days of the Axis, I should have titled this The Final Days of the Nazis. On December 16th, the Nazis launched a counterattack into Belgium through the Ardennes forest. This was the Battle of Bulge. That was the 101st Airborne there, they weren't expecting it, so the Germans made this 30-mile bulge in the Allied lines, and it was heavily fought over, and at Christmas, they said, troops of the 101st Airborne said, the best Christmas present they got that day was clear weather, because they were able to drop in supplies and aircraft were able to fly over. So the attack was repulsed, and it was really the last thing the Nazis did. And American and Soviet forces linked up at the Elbe River on April 25th, which was mostly symbolic, but it was a meeting of East and West there. And then a few days before, the Soviets entered the capital city of Germany, Berlin, starting the Battle of Berlin. Oh, no. So I thought that was going to be the next slide, but as the war wound down to a close, and really throughout the entire course of the war, Germany was trying to develop these Wunderwaffe, the wonder weapons. They were trying to build something that would give them an advantage during the war. So the only real things that came out of this were the first ballistic and cruise missiles in the V1 and the V2 that they used on England, and the first jet aircraft we've ever seen. What they wanted to develop was bombers that could reach America, lasers, super heavy tanks that are just basically land battleships that really didn't have a chance of going anywhere, weapons in space launched by V2 rockets, nuclear weapons, which they were actually pretty close to, time travel devices, and genetically engineered weapons-bearing dinosaurs.
That's a dinosaur in the top right with the top of a tank mounted to its back.
Didn't happen in real life, by the way.
That's just great.
Okay, so none of the Wunderwaffe prevented or helped them win the Battle of Berlin, which was the final battle in Europe. It was one of the largest battles of the war, 2.5 million Soviets against basically everybody in Berlin. He basically told everyone to take up arms and defend the city. Not everyone did, but it was still enough to make it a pretty bloody battle. On April 12th, FDR dies, and so Hitler, in his bunker under the Reichstag, thinks he has a chance of surviving. But 18 days later, after a history of writing books and getting people fired up, making speeches and getting fired up, he puts a gun in his mouth and he fires up. So he kills himself, and then a few days later, the battle is over, the Allies declare victory in Europe. We blow up all the Nazi signs. Berlin is basically, from a combination of the Soviet fighting, the constant bombing that's been going on since 1941 and all that, Germany is pretty much in ruins.
Wait, so who shot himself?
Hitler.
Hitler shot himself?
He shot himself. He got married to his longtime mistress, and then they both committed suicide together.
There's so many conspiracies around
Yeah,
that though.
they never found Hitler's body.
They never found his body, and there's signs that they did find his body, and when they did, he was on so many drugs that you can't even count.
There was there's theories that he escaped the Berlin bunker. I've read one where he escapes the Berlin bunker and he gets on a U-boat. Like
Goes to
guys
Cuba.
Like that.
There's one that he actually survived in Cuba up until his death.
There,
Maybe he actually did make it.
you know, yeah, maybe he did make a time machine. Maybe,
And there's some that say that his mistress killed him.
yeah. You know, maybe Hitler really is a reptilian. Iron Sky, see it in theaters. So, going to the Pacific now, where the fight's raging, everyone's kind of turning their eye towards it now. The Japanese began to have kamikaze attacks. Kamikaze translates to defined wind, and it's basically suicide attacks. You load up your plane full of bombs, and you crash it into a ship and hope for the best. And so, American forces invade Iwo Jima and Okinawa. There's the iconic picture everyone has to have seen of the Marines raising the American flag atop Mount Suribachi. That was on Iwo Jima. That was basically the end of the battle, is once they raised the flag. As they took these cities, as they took these islands, the bombers were able to have bases closer to Japan so they could carry less fuel and more bombs. So they were, you know, firebombing Japanese cities using napalm, which is take gasoline and make it basically jello, and you've got napalm. And it was really effective against Japan because what they had built their buildings out of was mainly wood, paper products, stuff like that, stuff that burns really easily. So almost, you know, at most almost 1 million civilians were killed in this firebombing. Cities were pretty much burned to the ground. But the Japanese kept fighting. They were intent on it because their culture is they don't accept surrender very well. They would prefer to fight to the death over surrender because they lose faith in their culture, and that in Japan faces life pretty much.
It's Confucian ideas.
Yeah. Kota Bushido and all that. So as this is all going on, through the whole war, we have the Manhattan Project running, which is the effort to build a nuclear bomb. And so he tests the weapon, and then when Harry Truman finds out about it, he weighs the nuclear option against Operation Olympic, which is the proposed invasion of the Japanese Hall Islands. Olympic was basically took all the losses we had taken, multiply it by 2, and kill basically everyone in the Japanese Isles for the lowball, most conservative estimate. He weighed these options, and he sent an ultimatum to Japan that you can either give up, or sometime, someplace, somewhere, something big is going to hit you. Maybe. It could be happening right now.
Fingers crossed.
That's basically what the Japanese said. They were, you know, they wanted this chance to fight to the death because of just how their culture is. So on August 6, 1945, Paul Tibbets, piloting the Enola Gay, which was named after his mother, drops the first atomic bomb, which was named the Little Boy by one of the people who worked on the project, on Hiroshima, Japan. And it destroyed the city. No one had ever seen anything like this before. We reiterate the ultimatum, they turn it down. 3 days later, we nuke Nagasaki. And so shortly after that is when the Japanese gave up. And so one of the big, you know, it was a terrible option. You either trade thousands of American lives to end this war, or you end a bunch of Japanese lives using this weapon you've been developing for most of the war, which you don't know all the effects of. The Purple Heart, the medal that American soldiers get for being wounded in action, the ones being given out today are ones that were manufactured for Operation Olympic, the invasion of Japan. We haven't made new ones for years because we've had this surplus in preparing for the invasion of Japan. So after we blow those 2 cities off the map, the Japanese call it quits. Victory over Japan is declared, and the war is over. Now it's time to try the war criminals, carve up the land, and then get your hands on some of the nice technology the Germans were developing. So at Yalta and Potsdam, the Allied leaders met to discuss who would have influence over what? Who would control what? And the Soviets, since they suffered the most losses, as we'll see in a second, and they had the most area and had one of the biggest contributions to the war, got the largest sphere of influence. They got most of Germany, all of Eastern Europe, and the Western Allies pretty much had what they had. But each group was granted a zone in Berlin. So you had the city of Berlin with 4 zones in it, in the middle of Soviet-occupied territory. This would become a point of contention when the Cold War sets in, with the Berlin blockade, and just generally with Berlin. It was kind of the flashpoint of the Cold War for a little while. You got it, Elliot?
Yep.
Alright. So, as Hitler used these various groups, the groups that I listed, to drum up support for the Nazi Party, using them as scapegoats, as fall guys, as one of the Nazis' big points was that of an Aryan master race, blonde hair, blue eyes. And so these groups did not fit that, or they were enemies of the Soviet Union, they were used as scapegoats. So they locked them in the concentration camps, and before they came up with the final solution, which Hermann Göring, Hitler, everyone in the Nazi Party was a part of this. So as the traps started to close, they decided to basically liquidate all these people, because we don't want the Allies finding out about these horrible things that we've done. So the numbers I have here is just the lowest, most conservative estimates of the number of people killed by the Nazis in what we call the Holocaust. It ranges up to almost 100 million. It's, you see pictures of rail carts packed full of gold wedding rings, of mountains of shoes and stuff like that. That's just the sheer industrial scale they killed these people on, almost on a daily basis. They had it down to a science, pretty much. So the military death toll of everyone involved was, almost everyone suffered about, Nazi Germany lost at least 4.3 million people. Japan lost 2.12 million. But the Soviet Union lost the most out of anybody, even with the lowest estimates, because of basically how they played the game. There's two, you can either choose to attack an area smartly, or you can basically just throw people at it until if you break through. Same reason as how, you have a rock in the middle of the ocean, eventually the waves are going to wear it down. Elliot?
It was supposed to be 383,800.
Yeah. For the,
UK.
yeah, that's British losses throughout the war.
3,838,000 right there, yeah.
Yeah.
Or is it just 383,000?
383,300.
Okay, but it could be 3,838,000.
Oh, that's an extra zero. 0.0. There should be a point before that last zero.
There you
Someone
go.
lost like a figure or something, so. But, going back to why the Soviet losses were so big, first off, it was their tactics just, throwing people at an objective until they got it. And they were fighting with most of their population base at the time, too. And they had, there was all of these military losses. I love the insult of Russians. And so, on the civilian side, again, the Soviet Union lost a lot of people. This was mainly due to famine, because everything was going to the Red Army. They were fighting this German war of aggression, they were fighting this great patriotic war, so you don't need your bread. These guys out here fighting for you need your bread more than you do. So at least 13 million people died there, at least 12 million people died in China because of what the Japanese were doing. And I didn't list American civilian casualties because it would basically add up to 4. it was a family in Oregon at the very start of the war. The Japanese were filling up like these giant weather balloons and sending them, trying to, terrorize the population, putting bombs on them. And so a family of 4 was killed by basically a balloon bomb. And they were basically the only people who died in the U.S. as a result of the war. If you want to count American citizens who were overseas, go ahead, but I did. In comparison to, even military and civilian losses, the Axis lost, at least 1.5 million people for Nazi Germany, at least 1 million for Japan, because of the fire bombings. The bombing of the cities, these civilian population centers. There's a case, the bombing of Dresden. It's showcased in Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse 5. It's, that's a point of debate whether it was a legitimate military target, but the Allies pretty much wiped that city off the map and took about 200,000 people with it, all in about 3 days.
We don't talk about Dresden.
We talk about Dresden.
We don't talk about Dresden.
And then in Japan with, with the fire bombings, it'd be a topic for a really good debate whether we needed to use the atomic bomb or whether Japan was done because of the fire bombs and stuff like that. I personally believe that we needed to use it because they needed to be terrified into, they've got this big thing that with one bomb can wipe an entire city off the map. We kind of don't want to screw with these guys anymore. So after the war was over, everything had stopped, we started trying the Nazis for their war crimes at Nuremberg, Germany. Hermann Göring, basically all the major Nazis who didn't commit suicide or survive the war were sentenced to either death or imprisonment because of their association with the Nazi Party, most of them because of their association with the quote-unquote final solution in dealing with the Jews, the other minorities that they persecuted. Many of them were killed, and their ashes were dumped down the Munich gutter. In Tokyo, there were a few Japanese war criminals to try just because we killed them all in the first place. So there weren't really many people to try in Japan for war crimes. So I just want to make sure you guys. So after the war, we saw all these crazy great things the Germans were developing, and the Americans launched Operation Paperclip, which was to obtain these advanced technologies and to capture their scientists. Among these notable targets were Wernher von Braun, he built the V-2 rocket, and he's basically the reason why we had our space program, why we won the space race by going to the moon. He was NASA pretty much. He designed all the rockets, so there was no American space program. It was Wernher von Braun. Samples of V-2 missiles, because those were the first real guided missiles in history, and we used those to develop our intercontinental missiles that we would use against the Soviet Union. And then Werner Heisenberg, he was a nuclear physicist who did work with nuclear weapons. Not as you think in Breaking Bad, he did not cook and sell meth.
Did a lot of other things though.
Yeah, he did a lot of other things though. So immediately after World War II, there was about 3 years of peace or so until 1948, until the Cold War really set in between the US and the Soviet Union. It was mainly fueled by a nuclear arms race and just differences between the East and West. The West was democratic, free state. The East was communist, totalitarian communist regime. And we had worked with the Soviets during the war and supported them because of the premise that my enemy's enemy is my friend. But after the war, we kind of had a falling out with them just because we were so different. This was fueled also by the division of Germany and the division of Berlin, and by the nuclear arms race. The Soviet Union detonated their first nuclear weapon in 1949. They knew about the Manhattan Project. They had their people in it for a long time. So when Truman told Stalin at the Potsdam Conference, we're developing this weapon of great power, Stalin could basically have said, I meddle. Which probably would have given Truman a heart attack. And so this was called, the East-West Division of Berlin was called the Iron Curtain. And this Iron Curtain, a term coined by Winston Churchill, would hang over Europe for 44 years. That concludes my presentation. Any questions?